Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. What's the scariest story you know? Also, I just want to thank all of you because today, May 24th, is my 4-year anniversary narrating with this channel. It's been a total pleasure, and I hope to continue to help bring you guys some stories every day. So I'd like to thank the team and all of you. In the meantime, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Everything to do with Hajj Mohammed Mesfui. He was a shoemaker who lived in Morocco in the late 19th and early 20th century. He and his accomplice, a 70-year-old woman called Anna, used to drug and kill young women who came to the shop. Eventually, one of the victim's parents traced her movements to the shop, and after the remains of 36 mutilated corpses were discovered nearby, Mesfui and Anna were questioned and tortured. Anna didn't survive, but Mesfui confessed to murdering them, usually for a tiny amount of money. His initial sentence was crucifixion, a very unusual punishment even then. However, there were many protests from powerful foreign embassies, and Morocco couldn't do much against them. Instead, he was sentenced to beheading, a more common punishment. However, the mood in Marrakech was that this was far too lenient, so they settled on immurement, being walled up alive. A special cell was constructed in the wall of the bazaar, about 2 by 2 by 6 feet. Chains were attached to one wall to ensure he would be kept standing. Mesfui wasn't told of his fate until the morning of his execution, when he was led, screaming in chains, and slowly bricked up inside. Once the last course had been laid, the crowd would fall silent until he started screaming, when they would cheer. He screamed nearly constantly for 2 days. On the third day, he fell silent. I was pulling weeds around our fields. There was a massive wild cucumber plant growing and just taking over a huge area, and it was spreading and making everything worse. I decided to dig it out instead of just ripping out the vines because it was just going to keep growing and getting worse. I got to the roots and assumed it would be like a blackberry root, but I was wrong, and it was huge. So I kept digging and I realized it looked like a dead body. I panicked for a moment and started to notice I had dug the shovel into it a few times and could see green root. Turns out wild cucumbers are also called man root because the roots grow into the shape of a man in the fetal position. They easily get up to 200 pounds, and some have been found to weigh over 450 pounds. I'm starting. A female friend in college disappeared from a party at another university in the city town 25-ish miles north of our school. She had arrived with another friend who I believe had driven. At some point, she split off to play cornhole or something and was later inexplicably gone. Phone calls went to voicemail, police were called, but she was simply missing. About 10 days later, she was found by a homeless man who witnessed her crawling up to a bus stop in the city, begging for help. She had broken a leg and an arm and was in very bad shape. At the quite large party, she had her drink secretly drugged and was then led off by a group of men into their vehicle. She was taken to an apartment where she was drugged, repeatedly AR'd, and locked in a small room in between with a bucket to use the bathroom. At one point, after being injected with heroin and AR'd, she somehow managed to convince one of her captors to allow her to use the actual bathroom to clean herself up. The bathroom had a small window to the outside, and, with the shower running, she managed to squeeze out and fell from the 3rd story into a large hedge or bush. From there, she crawled from the apartment complex to the road and bus stop, where the homeless man saw her and called police. Many cars stopped upon seeing her, making her captives unable to recapture her. The 3 men were later arrested for the crime after surveillance cameras allowed police to locate the apartment which she jumped from. She returned to our university almost 2 years later, graduated and became a nurse. She was obviously traumatized, never partied again, carried a pepper gas everywhere she could, and somehow moved on with life. It was a terrifying tale none of us ever forgot. She was an 18-year-old freshman when the incident happened. There's that video of a club, I believe, that catches fire. A band is playing, and as they use their pyro stuff, the stage catches fire, and then the whole building goes up in flames. It took, I believe, about 40 seconds or something from the stage to the entire building catching fire. And as people are trying to leave, it gets clogged at the doorway, and people are trapped inside, being burned alive and dying of asphyxiation. There's video of it too. It's 1000% haunting, but it's permanently stuck in my memories. I mean, we've covered the topic on the channel before, and also it was the Station Nightclub, and 100 people died, and 230 were injured, and the band that was playing was Great White. Terrible story. I grew up in a small town in Indiana, and one of our family friends told us a story about how his truck broke down a few miles outside of town one night. This was a small farm community, so there's not a lot of traffic or light pollution, so he was in total darkness. His truck broke down between two cornfields, and he decided to walk the rest of the way home. He walked for about 20 minutes in the pitch black until he smacked face to face with someone or something. He ran all the way back to his truck and locked the doors and slept in it for the night. I'd imagine some other dude has a similar story though. One of my buddies in school had an EMS instructor. They asked him what the worst thing he ever saw was. He recounted a call he got about a couple having a fight. The boyfriend doused his girlfriend in gasoline and lit her on fire. When they got there, she was still burning, crying and screaming, "I'm sorry," over and over and over again. When they finally put her out, she was burnt to a crisp. Not a single part of her skin was anything but black, and she was still alive. When they were loading her into the ambulance, she managed to grab the EMS and ask him, "Am I going to die?" He told her the truth. After that, everyone went quiet, and he asked if anyone had any other questions. Nobody did. Don't ask medical folk the worst thing they've ever seen. Dr. Carl Tanzler and Maria Elena Milagro de Hoyos. Tanzler was a German-born doctor practicing in Key West in 1930 when he met 21-year-old Maria Elena, who was suffering from tuberculosis. He believed that he had received a vision of his true love from one of his ancestors when he was younger, and Maria was the woman in the vision. He became obsessed with her and tried everything he could to save her. Unfortunately, Maria died in October of 1931. Tanzler paid for her funeral and paid for an above-ground mausoleum to be constructed for her final resting place. However, his obsession with Maria did not stop with her death. In April of 1933, Tanzler stole Maria's body from the mausoleum and brought it to his house. He attached piano wires to the corpse's bones, attached glass eyes to its face, filled the abdomen and chest with rags, and covered the body with silk mixed with plaster of Paris and a homemade wig, with Maria's real hair that Tanzler got from her mother. He lived with the corpse for 7 years, until Maria's sister heard a rumor that he was living with a corpse and told the authorities, who then removed Maria's body and arrested Tanzler. Tanzler was found competent to stand trial, but was released as the statute of limitations had expired. Maria's body was removed from the home and then placed on display at a funeral home, before eventually being placed back in the cemetery in an unmarked grave. Tanzler moved to Central Florida and created a life-size effigy of Maria that he lived with till his death. There's this Poe story where the guy thinks his cousin is hot, especially her teeth, which he thinks are perfect. His cousin ends up getting a disease that disfigures her, and she gets worse and worse, but her teeth stay pretty and white, and the guy gets more and more obsessed with them. Eventually the girl dies and is buried. The next night the guy snaps out of a daze in his living room with no memory of the last few hours. His clothes are all dirty, and there's a muddy shovel next to him. Somebody comes in and tells him that someone heard a noise in the graveyard, and when they investigated, they found that someone had dug up his cousin's body, which had revived. It turned out that she was alive the entire time, just paralyzed from the disease. The person who found her said her face was disfigured, The narrator notices that there's a box on the mantel. He opens it, and inside, there's 32 perfect white teeth. I was staying in a cabin that had an outhouse. I needed to shit, so I tried to poop as quickly as I could because I didn't want to be out there because it smelled. I shat so hard and so fast that I got backsplash from whatever that was laying 15 feet below. The outhouse hadn't been pumped in about 10 years. When it happened, I screamed and my soul left my body. There was no amount of washing that could ever make me feel clean. I was so shook at what happened, I had to tell someone that was there, so I told my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law told everyone, and now the whole family calls me Backsplash. I died a little on the inside that day. I don't know if this is true, and I'm probably forgetting details. It was winter, and there was heavy snow outside. A little girl ran into her mother's room at night and said, "Mommy, there's a monster outside my window." The mother reluctantly let her daughter sleep in her bed. In the morning, there were footprints in the snow leading up to and away from the daughter's window. I got two. I know of a story of a man being taken to execution. He'd been charged for killing a man. He spoke to a priest before he went. The guy started out stealing a few cents, I think 25, fell in with a gang, and eventually killed someone. Think about that. Stealing a few cents to killing someone. That's how easy it can be. Another was when a man broke into my mother's house and tried to arm my little brother in his own room. When my mom was woken up by the commotion, he just smiled at her and walked away. He's not in jail. Ricky's story, despite knowing so little of it. When I was a kid, my dad worked at the horse racing tracks. He introduced me to another little girl there. I was told to call her Ricky, and that her dad was a coworker. Ricky was thin, withdrawn, and got frightened when asked totally normal kid questions. She refused to discuss her last name, how to spell her first name, her home life, where her mom was, and the way her and her dad acted toward each other was extremely odd. Eventually I caught the hint and quit asking questions. Just try to do whatever I could to help her relax and feel better. So we'd run into each other every summer at various racetracks our dads were working at, and usually I'd find some way to work out a sleeping arrangement that let her stay with me away from dad's in general. The one time we tried staying in a tent near her dad's camper, she was so tense I thought she'd snap before morning. Ricky was a little older than me, but happy to go along with my childish games of make-believe. One summer, a man, another dad's co-workers, stopped us to compliment her freshly shaved legs. I didn't exactly understand what was going on, but I did not like the way this man was speaking to my friend and feeling her legs when she was clearly frozen in fear. So I invented a game where there were dangerous monsters or wolves in the darkness, used baling twine to set traps around our sleeping place like I'd read about in books. Actually did catch my dad in one late night the first night. She slept better for being surrounded in traps and having her safety taken so seriously. After the racetracks started closing down for good, Dad suddenly announced that he was sending me away to live with Ricky and her dad, so I could attend the same one-room schoolhouse she did and put valedictorian on my college applications. The smile on his face while repeating this over and over was that dollar signs for eyes one you see in the cartoons. I didn't understand exactly, but I knew I didn't want to go live someplace that didn't have big libraries. When Ricky and her dad showed up to get me from 2 states over, me and my dad were having a screaming argument while I refused to pack my suitcase. Me and Ricky got kicked out to the backyard while the dads talked for hours. Screamed if we tried to go inside for water or the bathroom. I tried asking Ricky about her school, and she, curled in the fetal position and listlessly picking at the dirt, said very, very quietly that I wouldn't like living with her dad. Dad was furious when they left without me. A few weeks later, he started talking, with the same smile, about how low the legal age for marriage with parental consent was in our state. In retrospect, that man was not Ricky's father, and I can't find Ricky because I never did know his name. I heard it on Radio Rental, Episode 4, Laura of the Woods. A boy befriends a little girl he mysteriously encounters in the woods near his home. He keeps it from his parents and comes back every so often to play with her. Turns out the little girl died years ago, and it was actually her mother the entire time, dressing up and acting like her. Still gives me goosebumps. Had a friend whose partner had some psychotic break or something, and he was on the dark net, stream torturing her hostile style. She survived by faking she was dead, which was far from the truth. He stabbed her in her genitals with a steak knife and drove a screwdriver into her head with a hammer, amongst other things, at the beck and call of people who bidded on what to do next. After he believed her to be dead, he laid down flat on a freeway close to the trailer, but the next vehicle who came saw him and braked, also calling the police, unraveling the whole story. This was almost a decade ago in Sweden. Her name is Moa. She lives, although in a wheelchair, depending on nurses. I still dream of getting the news. Lived in a hotel for 2 months while waiting for a lease to end. Went out on a date and it led nowhere. We were just walking in her Aveo for an hour or so. Before I got into her car, I noticed a guy walking with a massive camping setup on his back. As I'm looking at him, he turns and stares right into my eyes and asks how far to the next town. This was Woodbridge, Virginia off Route 1, so I said Fort Belvoir. Says goodbye and gets into my truck. The hotel I was staying in was right past Fort Belvoir, so I'm heading north on Route 1. I see the guy on the side of the road, so I pull over and ask him if he wants a ride. Dude jumps in. We BS on a short trip. Guy tells me family members are looking for him because he was deeded tribal land in Oklahoma and they want to kill him. I was still bummed about the date, so I just listened and nodded. I noticed that despite it was 90 plus degrees at night, humid Virginia summers, he didn't have any BO or smell. He just walked an hour and wasn't even sweating. I'm sweating despite the AC being on in the truck. I remember there's a homeless shelter right next to the army base entrance I was heading, so I suggest he stays there for the night. I always had work for priorities I rented out. I asked if he could help me with tree work the following morning. He agrees, and I drop him off at the shelter around 01:30 with my phone number and a time I'll pick him up the next day. Dude walks into the shelter, but never calls me the next day. So I call the shelter and inquire about the guy I dropped off. Lady says we lock the doors and don't allow anyone inside after 10 p.m. Back in the 1977s, living in Trinidad, there was a radio programmed late into the night. Think talk radio. A woman calls in. I can still remember it like day and night. Her and her husband were sleeping. Then, at about 3 a.m. in the morning, he gets off to bed, transforms himself into a beast. We call it a laghoo. Opens the window, wooden house with boards back then, and goes outside. She said she went back to sleep, then left him the next day. My mother told us that back when she was a university student in Algeria, she watched a seance of Ouija with her cousin. They were both too scared to participate, so they just watched from afar as their friends were playing. There was a closed door nearby, and it opened by itself, which is when my mom left the room out of fear. Smart decision if you ask me. She never got to know whether the girls said goodbye or not. But she said that one of the students who partook couldn't sleep for weeks.